Welcome to Communism in the World, the Victims of Communism Memorial Foundation's series dedicated to telling the true story of communist ideology, its history of political implementation, and the legacy of Marxist political economy. I'm Murray Bassett, Director of Academic Programs, and I'm pleased to be joined today by Peter Wolf. Now, I don't want to spoil too much, but I do want to introduce Peter briefly. So painting in broad strokes, Peter grew up in Germany. He immigrated to America in 1961 on one of the last immigrant ships, the MS Berlin. He graduated from the University of Illinois in 1973, where he studied physics and math. He worked as an engineer until 1985 when he realized his American dream of starting a successful business, owning a home, and raising a family in a free society. Today, Peter is president and founder of PhotoCrazy, Inc., and he frequently speaks to schools, civic groups, and organizations like the Daughters of the American Revolution and the Ronald Reagan Library. I'll leave it there, Peter, and simply add that we're very fortunate to have you here with us to share your story of the daring escape of you from communist East Germany and of your love for America. Now, just one quick note on the run of show. Following Peter's presentation, we will have a discussion drawing on questions submitted by the audience. You can submit your questions for Peter throughout the event using the Q&A function, which should be located at the bottom of your screen. Peter, I know our audience is excited as I am to hear this daring tale, so I'm going to turn it over to you.
Well, thank you very much, Murray. I appreciate being here and grateful for the opportunity to share my story. I grew up in a small town near Leipzig, Germany. This was in East Germany, which was controlled by communist Russia. What I would like to do today is share three topics: what it was like to live under communism, how I escaped that place, and finally, what I found in America, if we have time. The government controlled everything in East Germany. It controlled where you lived. Privileged people, those communist members of good standing, received better housing, for example, than the general populace. How much schooling you received was again by your privilege. My education would have stopped at age 14, and I'll explain that a little bit later why. The kind of work you did was also determined by your privileged status. All companies were owned by the government, so people were assigned work assignments, given work assignments that depended on how well they supported the communist regime. How much money you could save was also controlled by the government. For example, in 1955, the government changed their currency overnight. There was a Sunday when it was announced that new currency would be allocated the following day. It looked different and felt different. People that had saved up money more than they were supposed to were not given a chance to exchange it or buy anything with it. So many people lost enormous amounts of savings overnight. The medical help you received under socialism was, again, privileged people received better care than unprivileged people. Those that did not support the communist regime would not receive the same kind of medical attention. You also were better off by purchasing private doctors, the help from private doctors. But again, it took money to do that. When and where you traveled was also strictly controlled by the government. It was almost impossible to leave the country, but even going on vacation was allocated and designated where you could go. Everything was controlled by the government. What books you could read was also determined by the government. One of the most important books that was mandatory reading in East Germany was, interestingly enough, a American book, Uncle Tom's Cabin by Harriet Beecher Stowe. It portrayed the deplorable conditions that the Blacks lived under in the 19th century. And the government would tell you that this is how all Americans live, and anything else that we were told or found out in the news was strictly propaganda. Everyone in America lived in a very oppressed way, just like this book portrayed. What you could read or write was also strictly controlled. There was no freedom of speech or expression. They even controlled how you wrote. For example, I was left-handed and wrote with my left hand until I went to school. Then the teacher started to tear up all my assignments. The reason being is that all good communists had to write with their right hand. So I learned how to write with my right hand, but I still throw my baseball, with the left hand. Of course, baseball was not permitted over there since it was such an American sport. What kind of music you could listen to was also controlled. There was no rock and roll or Western style music. It was all forbidden. What news you would hear and see was also strictly controlled. Maybe some of you can remember the big placards on the freeway of a family huddled around a radio and indicating that it was Radio Free Europe they were listening to. That is exactly how it was. We as a family would huddle around a radio, turn the volume down very, very soft, and try to listen to Radio Free Europe. It was our only source of correct news. Everything else was propaganda. The reason we turned it down so much is to avoid having our neighbors hear it and then report us. Appliances like refrigerators, cars, TVs, those were only for privileged, good communists. The general population would not receive such privileges, and we certainly, in my family, didn't. What food you could buy? Again, the privileged individuals, the elites, had stores that carried almost everything. The rest of the populace had long lines to wait, and there was never enough food. Any kind of religion was forbidden. It was a weakness. We were told it was a weakness to rely on God or any type of religion. You had no choices, no freedom. You were watched all the time. You were spied on by your neighbors, and even children would spy on their parents. Frequently, the West would send balloons over our countryside and drop leaflets telling us of the oppression that we really lived under. We would collect those leaflets, and then the next day, the teachers would ask which parents were reading those leaflets. You're not supposed to read them. And many students would innocently say that their parents were reading them. And then the Stasi would come the next day, take those parents away and interrogate them and make their life miserable. Stasi being the secret police. Women were frequently subjected to mandatory examinations. A car with loudspeakers would drive through the area and announce that women of such an age and with last name starting from A to F or whatever were to go and report to their doctors the following day or the following week, and birth control was strictly enforced. People lived in constant fear. There was no hope. One lady I talked to, she said, people were treated like cattle. So in 1955, our family dream of going to America was crushed when my father died a very tragic death. The following year, in 1956, my mother left me at a neighbor's house not to arouse suspicion, and she took my sister, who was 16 years old at the time, to the border between East Germany and West Germany. She snuck across the border in a forest, trying to at least, when some Russian soldiers caught them. They spent the night, the 16-year-old, with my mother, who was maybe 42 years old at the time. They spent the night in the Russian barracks near the border, and then the next morning they were told to go back to Germany, East Germany. My mother did, started out at least, but she was a very determined woman, and she made a U-turn and then started going back into the forest. This time the soldiers yelled and screamed at them, but my mother, with my sister in hand, ran across the forest, and they started shooting after them. They heard the bullets whiz by them. They made it to the other side, and my mother left my sister after a week or so with some friends because my sister wouldn't want to return. She didn't want to return. So this 16-year-old girl was left alone, trying to make her way to America. My mother came back because I was still there. And as soon as she came back and they found out that my sister wasn't there, the Stasi came, took her for several days, interrogated her, and she was labeled a traitor. So was I. Her work assignments were changed to hard labor almost. She made military tents for the Russians, heavy tents. My schooling would have stopped at age 14. I was no longer able to go to higher education. I would have become an apprentice at some factory. My mother, it was made very clear to her, if she would ever come close to the border, within 20 kilometers anywhere of the Western border, she would be arrested, probably sent to Siberia into the gulags. And we knew of many people that had happened to, and they were never heard of again. I would have been put in an orphanage and raised properly under communism. On December 24th, 1959, I came upstairs after playing with my friends for lunch, and I noticed a small suitcase on my mother's bed. I was curious as to what the suitcase was about. And my mother explained to me that that evening, Christmas Eve, 1959, we would try to escape and rejoin my sister. I told her we couldn't do that. What if we get caught? She said she forged the documents. She told me to put a toy, one of my favorite toys, into the suitcase. I did. A little train. I still have it. Then I went back downstairs, and she told me to say goodbye to my friends, but not tell them where I was going. I did that, and then in the evening, after it was dark, we left our little apartment. We went about 2 blocks to a streetcar. We caught the streetcar, went to the nearby city, Leipzig. There we caught a train to go to Berlin. Now in Berlin, there was a subway, and the subway went in a circular pattern all the way around Berlin. It started out in the eastern sector of Berlin, and then traveled into the western sector. There was one stop there, and then traveled back into the eastern sector. We purchased a ticket from the eastern sector back into the eastern sector, and the intent was to get off on the West Berlin stop. When we got to the West Berlin stop, just prior to that, the doors opened. The Russian soldiers came on board, and there was one standing in front, one in the rear with machine guns, and a more senior officer would interrogate us. He interrogated everyone on the train, on the subway. There was a young couple in front of us, and they were interrogated, their paperwork was checked, and then the young couple, the officer gave them their papers back. The young couple sighed in relief and smiled at each other. The officer looked around, puzzled, and mumbled to himself, "I wonder what they're smiling about." And he realized that I understood. I spoke fluent Russian at the time. It was mandatory in school. And he said, "Do you speak Russian?" I said, "Da." And then in Russian, he asked me why I thought those people were smiling in front of us. Now, my mother, she had told me not to say a word at any time, that she was going to do all the talking. But the Russian soldier, and her hand was gripping me. It was very, very, very tight. She was afraid. And here I started speaking to this Russian soldier in Russian. My mother didn't understand a word, and she was obviously very worried. I told him that I had a pen pal in Moscow, and I didn't really know why these people in front of us were smiling. And he said, "Well, we better find out." And he motioned to one of his soldiers, and they took the couple out. They never returned. He looked at our documents, and my mother, you need to recognize, she was at a point of no return. If she were caught, if her forgery didn't work, it would have meant immediate prison for her, and worse. So he looked at the paperwork, gave it back to her, and moved on to other people and interrogated them. Eventually, the soldiers left the cabin in the subway, and the train started moving again. We got to the next stop. The doors opened, and just before the doors closed, my mother grabbed me and our little suitcase, and we snuck out the door. The doors closed, the train moved, we were free. We were in West Berlin. She asked a policeman where the nearest fugitive camp was. He directed us there, and here there were thousands of people, families. With children. Everyone had a little suitcase. They all escaped on Christmas Eve. There were so many that there wasn't enough room in the fugitive camp, and we were bused to a local factory where there were about 200 bunk beds lined up. That night, the men were snoring, the women were consoling their children. And I think I cried myself to sleep because I didn't get any Christmas presents. I felt sorry for myself. On every day, people would go from the factory to the main fugitive camp to do their paperwork, the heads of households. And then in the evening, they would return. This was to fill out the various paperwork to immigrate to West Germany. One day, apparently one of the bus drivers was paid off by the East Germans, and instead of taking a whole busload of heads of household to the fugitive camp, they were taken back to the East. Russian soldiers were waiting for them. It was awful. When the news reached us in the factory, the anguish I saw was devastating, unimaginable. Women and children needed to make a decision whether to go back to East Germany or go on without their husbands. My mother, luckily, was not on that bus. Many of the women gave their oldest children to friends so they could continue on to the West, and took the younger children and returned back to East Germany. Who knows what happened? So it was awful. In the spring of 1961, my mother and I embarked on a 10-day voyage. This would be 60 years today, to America. It was a one-way trip. Many nationalities were on the boat, about 1,000 people, I would say. It was a 10-day voyage, and for 7 days we didn't see any land. On the 9th day, the captain told us that if we wanted to get up early in the morning, we might be able to see the Statue of Liberty. So I was going to be pretty smart about it and look at that Statue of Liberty. I got up maybe 2 or 3 in the morning. And as I got up to the boat, it was dark and foggy and misty. Not a soul was up there. And as I worked my way towards the front of the boat, all of a sudden I bumped into someone. And I said, "Excuse me." And then I bumped into someone else. It was totally quiet. And as I reached the front of the boat, I wasn't the first one. I was probably the last one to reach the. I always get emotional about this. I was the last one to reach the front of the boat. Everyone was up there already, straining their eyes to see that Statue of Liberty that represented hope, freedom, liberty, opportunity. Eventually, we saw the light, the handle with the light and the statue, and then the statue itself. It was beautiful. Not a word was spoken. We landed docked in New York Harbor. We caught a train from New York to Chicago and were reunited with my sister. America was big. America, you could travel anywhere you wanted to. You could buy anything. You could live anywhere. You could say anything. You could read and write anything you wanted to. You could write right-handed or left-handed. You could study anything. You could even demonstrate. You could vote for anyone and were not coerced into voting for one particular person. You could work anywhere. You could start a business. You could listen to anything. People helped each other. You could even protect yourself and your family. You would live without fear. There were no spies. You could get medical help when you needed it. And most important, you could worship any way you wanted to. The real hero of this story is my mother. She was a 47-year-old single mom who planned and executed a very daring escape. After being in America for a few years or months, I realized that that Christmas Eve in 1959, my mother gave me perhaps the most important gift any parent can give their child, and that was the gift of freedom. I have cherished that ever since. I experimented with that newfound gift. I studied and worked hard. Vietnam War was raging. Civil unrest was happening. The 1968 election and protests. Breaking the law, I found out very quickly, didn't work very well. Honesty, integrity, good relationships, getting an education, that did work. I graduated from the University of Illinois. I was in my mid-20s. I had no religion. After all, it was a sign of weakness. I was afraid of marriage. I didn't know how to be a father or a husband. I earned good money, but something was missing. Something was missing. And I realized what was missing when someone introduced me to religion. It was the second great gift that I received here in America. It gave me a moral compass to do the right thing. You see, freedom by itself can be abused, but with religion, you develop a balance, and that leads to happiness and real joy. In 1976, I got the third gift, and that was my American wife, Teresa. We have lived together for 45 years now. We have 4 children and 13 grandchildren. And in any day now, we will be expecting our 14th grandchild. So those gifts just keep on giving. President Ronald Reagan once said, freedom is never more than one generation away from extinction. It must be fought for and protected, or one day we will be telling our children and our children's children what it was once like in the United States where men were free. I feel like today in this webinar, I was telling my children and my grandchildren what it was once like when men were free. Much has changed in the past few years. The freedom that I found in 1961 has been greatly diminished. Murray, that's my story. There are millions of other stories just like it. Thank you for letting me share my story on your Victims of Communism forum.
Peter, thank you so much for sharing your just profoundly moving story. Before we turn to some questions from the audience that have already come in, I do want to remind the remaining audience members that they can submit questions using the Q&A function at the bottom of their screen. First, congratulations on the coming grandchild, 14, right? That's fantastic. Grandchildren are a joy. I've seen this with my own parents, with my kids. I mean, it's just one of the things that provides sweetness to life. So congratulations to you and the whole family on that. The first question that comes to mind, and it's first because it's going to ask you about your first. I mean, you spoke about how your first glimpse of America, but after you got off the boat, what were the things that struck you immediately about the United States?
Well, as I mentioned, the size, the buildings themselves. When I first got close to the shore of New York, there was this long snake of something moving along the shoreline. As we got closer, we realized that that long snake were cars. I had never seen that many cars. The size of the buildings were just breathtaking. I had never seen anything like it. Although I do want to mention, when we got in the bus, maybe prior to that, I should also mention, there's a picture of me coming off the boat. And I had absolutely no idea what to expect in America. The only thing I knew was that there were Indians and cowboys. And we always dressed up as them in Germany. So when I came to America, I insisted on bringing a special gift that I thought I might be able to trade to someone. And that was a bow and arrow. So when you see me coming off the boat in that picture, I'm holding a big old bow and arrow as I come off the boat because I wanted to make sure that I had something that I could trade with. Well, anyway, that's a little humorous story. But that's just to show how naive I was about America. When we got on the bus, we moved along from the harbor to the train station. And we stopped at a red light. And at one point, we saw a lady. She had big red boots on, and she was carrying bags, a lot of bags. She was a bag lady. And everybody looked at each other in the bus because this is the sort of thing that you see in Russia, where people carry these big old bags and have red boots on. So for a moment there, we were very concerned. Were we really in America? We were. The train station was impressive. The train trip from from New York to Chicago was incredible. Day and night, I was up just admiring the vastness of this country. Those were my very first impressions.
Thank you. Have you returned to Germany since fleeing East Germany and then immigrating? And if so, have you noticed any persisting differences between East and West?
Interesting that you should ask that question. In 2009, this would have been 50 years after I escaped East Germany. In 2009, I flew from Los Angeles to Phoenix. And a man sat next to me. It turned out to be Michael Reagan, President Reagan's son. And we started talking. I didn't really know him, but I do know now that he was a famous commentator on radio shows. And he asked me about things, and he told me that he was going to put made a contribution to the museum at the Berlin border, at what used to be the the wall, where the wall used to be. He would make a Checkpoint Charlie museum contribution. And I told him that I had escaped East Germany through Berlin. Well, he didn't really believe me, but I gave him some references, and he ended up inviting me and my son to be on a delegation that he headed up, about 50 people, back to Germany. So this was very exciting. This would have been my first trip back to Germany, to East Germany. And I had an opportunity to visit the fugitive camp that I went to when we first escaped. They made a museum out of it. And quite frankly, it was very emotional. My son, who was 29 at the time, didn't quite understand why I got so emotional. There was a statue in front of the fugitive camp. It was a little bronze suitcase, very depictive because everyone showed up with a little suitcase. Inside the museum, everything was the same. It was like at the blink of an eye, I went back 50 years. It was incredible. I really couldn't stay there very long. I got too emotional about it. It turned out that 1.5 million people had escaped East Germany in a similar manner that I did. Now, on the last day in Germany, I made arrangements, and by accident, I got a hold of one of my old classmates in my hometown. And I called him on the last day that I was there, and he said, "Oh, Peter, you have to come. We're all getting together for dinner, and we want you to be there. You have to come." And of course, I was delighted to come, and we joined them for dinner. It was quite interesting to see people that you hadn't seen for 50 years. And we shared stories and memories. Of course, my son didn't speak any German, so he was kind of, he didn't know what to make of it all, but he recorded much of it, took a lot of pictures. And at one point, one of my friends said, "Peter, I want to show you something. Every year we get together, but we don't, we always have a little booklet that shows who is still with us, and some people have already died, unfortunately, from our class. And here is the booklet, but please don't be mad at us." I said, "Why would I be mad at you?" Well, on the last page, it said, "In memorandum, Peter Wolf." In other words, I had died. And I said, "What's this?" And he said, "2 years after you left, the communists told us that you and your sister were killed in a car accident. And of course, the reason for that is none of them wanted to, the communists didn't want any of those people left behind in East Germany to contact me and maybe work out a way for them to escape as well." So this is how devious communism is. At some point, one of my classmates, I asked, "What was it like to live for 40 years here in East Germany?" And the table that we were on became very quiet. Nobody said a word until one spoke up and said, "Peter, you would have had to live here to know what it was like." But then he said, "Peter, what was it like in America?" What can you tell them? How do you describe freedom to someone in a few words? All I could muster to say was, "You would have had to live it to know what it was like." Freedom is very, very precious, very dear. We don't ever want to lose it. Thanks for asking that question, Marie.
Thank you, Peter. Just a quick clarifying question. When you say fugitive camp, do you mean Marienfield or Marienfeld?
Yes, yes, exactly. Marienfelde. It's called
Marienfelde.
Marienfelde.
My German is exactly like this much. I recognize words, don't know how they're said. Now, near the end of your opening remarks, you mentioned that you felt that freedom has diminished here in the United States since you came in 1961. Could you tell us, which freedoms you feel have diminished, which of them are most important to you, and how you think that all of us can better protect those freedoms in particular?
Thank you very much for asking that question. That's a very good question. And I prepared a few notes about it because I thought about it. And there are many parallels between East Germany and America that we know of now. Let me give you some examples. Long lines and not allowed to go to church or gather in large groups. Now, a lot of that is, we are told, because of COVID, but there are other solutions to this, and it diminishes our freedoms. People are afraid of each other and suspicious. We have to wear masks. Many of the commodities are in shortage. Cleaning solution, ammunition, toilet paper, a lot of things that we normally take for granted are in short supply. People are losing jobs or businesses because of their political affiliation. Having to resign because of their political correctness someone that may not express themselves politically correct, and they end up having to resign. There's cancel culture, which causes people to lose businesses and employment when others try to cancel them. People are shamed because of their race. Nowadays, being white in particular, you're being shamed. It's terrible. In East Germany, under communism, you were shamed for being black or Jewish. People were spied on by neighbors and the Stasi in Germany. A lot of secret police. Nowadays in America, they don't need that secret police. People are so willing to give their information, their personal information, their thoughts and beliefs on social media. And all the government has to do is to compile that and use it against them. I would strongly recommend unsubscribing to all of your social media accounts. That's something that I did. Social media is a deceptive tool to gather incriminating evidence against anyone who uses it. People, ideologies, and publications like Parler, for example, are being censored in the United States, same as it was in East Germany. Pro-left and BLM and Antifa demonstrations and violence are being tolerated and even encouraged, while right-wing or MAGA demonstrations are labeled insurrection. Communist gatherings were applauded in East Germany, and any opposition demonstration were crushed with tanks and force. The governors of states dictate which businesses can stay open, where you can go and congregate, while elected legislative bodies are bypassed. It's exactly how it was in East Germany. There is a push in the United States to nationalize healthcare, other industries, and make people dependent on government subsidies, food stamps, extra unemployment benefits. These nationalized programs will give government leverage to enforce their ideology only if you conform to that ideology. I hear many people wanting to get vaccinated against COVID, but they can't get an appointment. Now, this is speculation on my part, but I wonder, has anyone looked into the connection between a person's political affiliation and their ability to be vaccinated? That is precisely how it was done in East Germany. You played the game and you became a good communist and you got the privileged services. You get what you need only if you conform to communism and its ideology, and if you were willing to spy on your neighbors. People in East Germany were controlled by fear. That is happening in the United States as well, I believe. Any form of communism will control people by fear. Communism is an evil ideology because fear emanates from only one source, and that is Satan. That's about it.
That's a whole lot. Yeah, it's a whole lot. What are your thoughts on the growing number of Americans who show support for socialism, given your firsthand experience in East Germany?
They obviously have not experienced or read about it. Ideally, communism sounds very appealing. This is how Marx and Engels and all these communists first developed their ideology, because it sounds very appealing to spread the wealth among many people instead of allowing people to work on their own and earn their own living. So it's an ideology that sounds great on books, but when you put it in practice, it becomes the elite and the privileged people that get everything, and the masses and the population get virtually nothing. They have to labor and slave away, while the privileged people get all that they need. I believe that many people don't understand that and don't comprehend it. They only look at the ideal conditions of communism and don't realize that wherever communism was started, it failed miserably. And of course, in the Soviet Union, it did also. But everywhere else, it also failed. It cannot sustain itself.
Indeed, the ignorance of history is a big explanatory factor. And I mean, you mentioned the appeal, the communist ideals. What's the phrase? It's liberty, equality, fraternity, or solidarity. Each one of those things are attractive, intrinsically valuable. I mean, no one is in favor of slavery, inequality, and alienation. But one of the complicating factors is, when we, as a classical liberal, liberal democratic people, say liberty, equality, and solidarity, we mean something completely different than the communists do. Another interesting question that came in. After reunification, did you ever request your Stasi file or that of your parents?
No, never even occurred to me. Would be interesting to see that. That would be very interesting to see that.
If you ever do, I would be interested in hearing more. And I think many of those in attendance would also be interested. So that might be a nice follow-up event for us to do. Another kind of, not so much technical question, but just factual one. Were there any private doctors in East Germany?
Yes, there were private doctors. Those private doctors usually help the elite and communist leaders. As a matter of fact, a cousin of mine was a private doctor. He had a private practice. I think he was a general doctor as well, but then he also offered private practice. And he visited us in 1989, actually, just before the Berlin Wall came down. And he had more money to spend than anything. He was very, very wealthy because he was paid so much. Of course, that money didn't do him any good. So when he came over here, and he was given privileges because he was a doctor to come here with his wife. And he bought a whole bunch of stuff at Costco. He just almost bought out Costco at one point. And air conditioning, microwaves, and all these things that he wanted. None of that was available in East Germany. So yes, there were private doctors, and they had made a lot of money, were privileged.
Thank you. So actually on the question of money, why do you think the communist East German government controlled and limited the amount of money that people could save?
Well, it was very uncommunistic-like to have a lot of money. You were not a good communist. You were not in good graces with communism. If you had a lot of money, you were supposed to share it with others. So, and having too much money typically was frowned upon because it would allow you to buy things and do things that were not in control of the government. So you were discouraged from having money and saving money. And you were typically given only enough to sustain yourself, at least at the time that I lived over there. You were not given more than you needed. Very, very strict about that. And this change in currency that I mentioned in 1955, that was just absolutely devastating because people Germans are usually very frugal and they save things. And when that came along, it was horrible. It was just horrible. I remember that.
Thank you. Now, how did you fight the cognitive dissonance and stay true to your own conscience while you were living under the unrelenting propaganda of the communist government? And were there any, small acts of resistance that you took part in before your mother arranged for your escape? And in one last kind of related question, what is your advice to Americans struggling to stand up for truth and freedom in the face of the fear of being canceled?
Tough questions here, tough questions. I was pretty young. When we left, I was about 13 or 14 years old. So I didn't get politically too involved, but I knew things were wrong because I saw people around me being taken away late at night. I remember one particular situation of a family. They had two boys, a little bit older than myself, and their mother and father were taken away late at night by the Stasi, and they didn't return. It ended up that the boys had to search for them, one prison after another, until eventually they found them at some prison where they had simply been dropped and forgotten. There were demonstrations in East Germany, but I remember tanks rolling in and squashing those demonstrations. These tanks, they would just roll in. Actually, many of them destroyed the streets in the process. There was a particular demonstration, I believe, in 1956. It started in another country, but it spilled over into East Germany. I forgot exactly.
The Hungarian Revolution.
Yes, Hungarian Revolution. Was that in 56?
It was, yeah. Yeah, actually, we had a question. It was going to be the next one that I asked from an audience member about, how East Germany felt the effects of the Hungarian Revolution in 1956.
There were many people in East Germany that I remember stood up and participated in that revolution, in that demonstration. And just like I mentioned before, all of a sudden tanks came, and if you didn't get out of the way, you were rolled over. And soldiers came, they were shooting at people. It was quelled and stopped in its tracks. There was no leniency at all. It was quelled and pushed down and stopped immediately. And the East Germans never had a chance to stand up and revolt. But slowly, the dissatisfaction, even when I was over there, was bubbling up, and people were getting more and more annoyed the way they were being treated by the communists. After I left, I understand that there were many, many demonstrations, and there was a regular demonstration every Monday, and that just accelerated and increased significantly until eventually in 1989 when the wall came down. My recommendation to people who want to demonstrate and stand up for what they believe in is by all means do it. I will demonstrate in a heartbeat. I'm a little older now, so my life is almost over. Not much can be done to me. But unless you stand up and fight for your freedom, it will be taken away from you. And by fight, I mean literally fight. Now, I don't know if it is appropriate to, and I don't think it was appropriate to go and storm the Capitol in Washington. But there are other ways that we can express our dissatisfaction with what is being done to us and the way our freedoms are being taken away. I strongly encourage people to stand up for our freedom, because if they don't, it will be taken away. And I think we already see how much has been taken away. So anybody that wants to demonstrate, let me know. I'll be there. I'll hold the American flag up very, very high.
Yeah, there is a very long and distinguished tradition of petitioning our government for redress of grievance, and doing so by peacefully assembling. And it's one of the core freedoms. It's one of the reasons why it's in the First Amendment, together with free speech and the freedom of assembly and guarantees of religious practice. Let's see, we are coming close to the end here, so I'm going to grab the last couple questions and kind of mix them together. So first, to what extent were you actually able to watch Western television or listen to Western radio? You mentioned, Radio Free Europe, but then also somewhat related, how accurate is the depiction of life in East Germany that we see in a film like The Lives of Others?
Very accurate, very, very accurate. And like I mentioned before, the billboards that showed many years ago how families huddled around radios and listened to Radio Free Europe, that's exactly how it was. Our neighbors, we didn't have a television, but our neighbors had a brand new television. It was tiny little, maybe a 10-inch screen or something like that. And we watched it. I remember watching Sea Hunt with Lloyd Bridges. That was one of my favorite programs to watch over there. And I guess they don't have to do much translating with him being underwater all the time. So, but when it became to interesting parts, the East Germans had radio towers that they put up and would block the signal so that, I don't know who pushed the button, but always at the most interesting moment, they would block the signals so you wouldn't receive these Western television stations anymore. And then they would release it again a few hours later. And they would just intimidate and annoy people as much as possible in East Germany. But people, yes, they live just like that film depicts. It's very real, and there are other movies as well. I don't remember many of them at this point, but there were many other movies that depict life in East Germany very much the way it really was.
Thank you very much, Peter. Thank you for joining us and for sharing your story. I'd like to thank our audience for attending. We did have one request on sharing a note of gratitude to our speaker. If you would like to do so, please just send us an email at our info account. We would be happy to pass those along. Please also join us for our next event in the Communism in the World series, which will take place on Tuesday, February 23rd at 10 a.m. Eastern, where the subject will be Pol Pot and Cambodia. We'll be joined by Dr. Bradley Merg, the Dean of Faculty of Economics and Administrative Science at Paragon International University in Cambodia. He's also a distinguished fellow at the Royal University of Law and Economics in Phnom Penh and senior research fellow at the Cambodia Institute for Cooperation and Peace. He's beaming in from all the way around the world. So we're very excited to have him. To learn more about our upcoming events, our curricular resources, our Witness Project episodes, our other professional development opportunities for teachers, and how to support our work, please visit us at victimsofcommunism.org. You can also follow our work on Facebook and on Twitter at VO Communism. For the Victims of Communism Memorial Foundation, I'm Murray Bissett. Thank you all again for attending, and have a great day.